felt pressure to perform your identity.
In the future, when you go into the working world, how will you create an environment like this?
What does it really mean for a culture to be appropriated?
I'm like almost overwhelmed. I was like, I'm really interested in like what they were having to say because I'm half Chinese. My mom like never taught me Chinese, even though she spoke it with her mom and her sister. She's like, I speak like poor man's Chinese. No one's gonna talk with you. And I guess until more recently, I've never really had like words to say how I feel about it.
I'm also half Chinese, and driving to this event, I was like, am I even qualified for this? Like, I almost identify more as a white person. Like, my experience growing up, I went to schools that were dominated by white kids and college too. And it's only been in my adult life that I've started thinking about that. Both of my younger siblings, they learned Chinese in school. My grandparents visited recently, and everyone was talking in Mandarin except I understood nothing. And so I was like this weird like interim generation where like I hadn't learned Chinese.
My mom would cook me scallops or shrimp, so inevitably like my locker would smell like seafood. All I wanted was PB&J. So there were just indicators that I was always the other. And I think there was a lot of safety in being Asian because I wasn't black or brown. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize until my adulthood and having my own son who looks very, very Asian when his father's white, that the race talk needs to be had so much earlier. And I think race should become more common language among friends and family, but we just don't have the tools to do it. Mm-hmm. Because then when you are faced with that injustice, you don't know what to do. How are we going to talk about this? How are your friends different? How are we the same? Mm-hmm. What is that language? Why do they dress that way?
Where the intersection is between wellness and spirituality and social justice and having conversations around race and whatever it may be. And there's no language to talk about difference, and race is just such a taboo topic. One of the questions was around creating spaces where you can be open. As a person of color, I'm dismantling all of the ways that white supremacy has like molded the way that I see others and the way I see myself. So I'm also very like perfectionist by nature. If I do something and realize I messed up later, it like creates an entire shame spiral, as opposed to having a space where like there are shared cultural norms where people feel like they can talk about things. When like there's not language around it, when bringing it up makes people feel threatened, so that people don't bring it up, so that it's not talked about. And in those spaces, majority quote unquote norm is then what gets upheld.
And especially in my family, one thing that we've struggled with is I feel like when you try and open up those conversations, like both parties just feel shut down. Like whoever brings up the problem, the other party just feels like cut off.
Having the conversation, like I feel anxious just thinking about it.
Have like the literature and this and that and all these things to back up why I feel this way, then you're like, how can I start to go down this road?
Yeah.
I went to a couple of protests in Portland and I got like badgered on the train, like, why are you standing up for Black Lives Matter? And like, it's almost like you want to freeze up because you're like, okay, no, I don't know all the statistics of all the horrible things that have happened to people of color, like, but I guess, yeah, it's just like overcoming this, like, you don't have to know everything to start a conversation.
It just further institutionalizes the Asian silence, right? It's like we haven't figured out collectively how to come together, talk about hate crimes against Asians during the time of COVID, but I don't feel like we have the full consciousness to talk about it or the spaces to do it.
Particularly for East Asian, the proximity to whiteness, the option is, oh, you can assimilate into whiteness or nothing. Like there's no acknowledgement of being Asian.
I grew up in like mostly white neighborhood and like then like even just to Ann Arbor, Michigan for school, I was like, whoa, there are Asian people who do all sorts of things. And just like talking about this now, how I've like dealt with things my whole life, you know?
Yeah. And it feels refreshing to like talk to a group of people and not have to feel like you're speaking for like all Asian American women or something.
Yeah, or like be the only person in the room and be like, well, you're the woman of color. And then you're like, who?
I consult in a lot of spaces where it's predominantly white and a lot of times it's male. And I think about that performance thing all the time.
I feel that in my body. I'm like,
do you? Oh, if I go into a space, so I go into spaces where I draw while people are talking. And so I'm largely silent. So I go in with my equipment, set up, do the job. Everybody talks all day long. They discuss, they debate. I pack up my stuff, say thank you to the client, and I leave. And that has really started to mess with my psyche. Sometimes I do things to resist that, like I'm extra boisterous when I go up to the client and I'm like, oh, it's so nice to meet you, and I'm just overly enthusiastic. I'm like, then maybe they won't think that all Asians are quiet. Or
for me has been living internationally and experiencing my race relative to other cultures. And so experiencing what it feels like to not be looked at with suspicion. And then returning to the US, moving to Ann Arbor, in a city that's like predominantly white, in a university that's historically white and predominantly white, and feeling all of those expectations. Literally felt like walls were closing in on me.
It's like so funny to me too that you got that experience coming to Ann Arbor, and I felt like opened up coming even here.
So I grew up outside of Richmond, Virginia, and it's very conservative. Like Confederate flag, white liberal folks who think they're like good. At least I know where you stand and you're not for me, and like that's
I'm gonna
that.
stay away from you.
Yeah.
A lot of my Chinese family members are Trump supporters too, so it's a very strange world.
Yeah.
How does that identity come into play with Trump? Like, what are the points that they support?
So my grandfather left China during the Cultural Revolution because his father had this like huge religious like sect that he had come up with, and he was like a religious leader, Christian leader. Anyway, so when they left China, it was kind of similar to what some people were saying in the previous Cascade, is they just like hated the communists and they like super hated China. And so when they got to the US, it was this place where they could build their own business and like be self-made men and build their own wealth like on their own. And so I think they identify with Trump as like a self-made man. And it was just super crazy seeing my like old Chinese grandpa like yelling at the TV like, make a harder deal with Taiwan. Like now he doesn't support Trump anymore, which I think is interesting.
That, like you said, that release of tension and just being able to like hang your hat and talk freely it's been priceless, and I didn't know that I needed it until it happened. Or the microaggressions that you would say to anybody else, you'd say, oh, it's not a big deal. But here in this space, you could talk about it freely and everybody would be nodding their heads and they'd be like, oh yeah.
I've always been told like, oh, it's like probably in your head kind of thing. What can we do now for our next generation to like help them, give them the tools so that the same things aren't happening to them?
That was my question too.
Yeah, well, you've had some experience in it.
Yeah. There was another Asian kid in his class in kindergarten, an Indian kid, who actually did the chink eyes thing to him. And then he came home and told me about it, and I had to explain it to him because it had already happened to him at age 5.
Oh.
And so now he's extremely empathetic to, oh, I see this happening, and I think that was really mean, or like he started to have the language for it. And the next talk I want to have with him is like, how do you stand up for it when you see that injustice happening?
What can we do for future generations to give them the tools to talk about race and kind of break this cycle of silence?
How has your relationships with your family and especially your parents affected your racial and ethnic identity?
When was the last time you felt harm because of your identity, and how would you go back and change how you reacted?